Hi, everyone. I'm Keith Mathis with the Mathis Group, and we are a Premier ATP. Welcome to 7 Minutes to the PMP Mastery video. Today, we're going to be talking about something that will help you really kind of key in on the specific questions. The title of today's video is Spot the Real Question, Not the Story. Now, one of the things that you probably know is that the PMP test is filled with scenario questions. Those scenario questions can be very tricky because it can get you going in a direction that they're not really asking you on the test question. So let's focus on some things to ask ourselves and tell ourselves during the middle of a PMP test that will help us be able to understand what is happening in that test question and what are they really asking me. So let's go do a deep dive into this area. So first off, spot the real question, not the story. They're going to have a story or a scenario. And so PMP questions are like a movie plot. The twist is never really the plot. The twist is going to be something else that's outside of the plot. So much of the scenario, some of the scenario will just throw you off. It's just ancillary information that means absolutely nothing. So you've got to spit those bones out like you're eating fish, okay? And so then look and see, okay, what are they really asking me in this test question? Spot the real question, not the story, is what we're focusing on here. And so ignore the noise. Ask what decision is being tested. Are we talking about the people? Are we talking about processes? Are we talking about the value? And an example for an example would be a long story about emails might really be testing choosing the right communication channel. But before you know it, you're caught up into the topic of the email, not realizing that really what they're talking about is communication channels. And so it could be a little bit broader than what the test question or what the scenario is talking about. The other part of this is what's step one? So reread the story or identify the decision being asked. And so they're real big on the test to ask you what should you do first or what would you do? They're really not asking you what you would do. They're asking you what the process would do. For a matter of fact, if you answer it the way you would do it, you're probably going to miss the question because most of us are not 100% doing things the way PMI does it. So the exam frequently hides the decision inside several sentences of narrative. And so reading the final two sentences, if it's a real big question, allows you to be able to frame the context correctly. But most of the questions since 2022 have dropped down significantly to where they're much smaller. But typically the last couple of sentences still ask you what they're wanting to know, and then you go through and read the question, and allows you to spit the bones out faster and saves you a read through most of the time. Answering plan-driven questions. This is going to be traditional project management. So some of the common question endings. So what should the project manager do next? We're talking about a process. What should the project manager do first? That's talking about a process as well. What should have been done? They're looking to see if you can see what happened and what does PMI think should have been a way to handle that in the first place. What should the project manager do to prevent this issue? So in other words, they're looking at it hasn't happened yet, but what should you do? In other words, you're trying to mitigate that situation, or you're trying to make sure that that issue never happens. What is the best action? So remember, you're not answering it based on the real world. You're putting yourself into the framework of the PMI world. Finding the trigger wording. Trigger wording is all through this test. So trigger words, for an example, might be a conflict, and so the signals that they're giving you is the team facilitation or leadership. The other trigger word could be change request. And what are they looking at is really the signal is it's integrated change control because that seems to be the connection. Risk identified. They're typically going to be talking about risk management process. Stakeholder complaint. They're looking at stakeholder engagement because in traditional, you're going to be engaging that stakeholder. And then velocity or sprint. You're looking at an agile framework anytime that is typically used. And then a vendor issue, they're typically talking about procurement management. So you want to make sure that when you're reading this, that you're going in the right direction. You're seeing the trigger words and even in addition to this, keywords and also what it signals. So eliminating wrong answers. Of the multiple answers, and you could have anywhere from 4 to 7 answers based on the way the new test is now. Wrong answers usually contain these type of patterns, so you can usually spit these out pretty quick. Skipping process steps is a no-no in the PMI world. So if a vendor or VP asks you to skip this process, that's typically not going to be your right answer. Authoritarian leadership. Somebody comes in, the CEO says we're doing it this way. That's probably not going to be your right answer. Now in the real world, world, you would do it, but not on the test. Ignoring stakeholders. A stakeholder is asking or giving input on this, and so you ignore them because it doesn't fit what everybody else is doing. Immediate escalation. You don't typically escalate a lot on the test questions, because what happens is you've got the power. You're a project manager. You're in a projectized organization most of the time, unless it lets you know that you're in traditional. And so you've got most of the power. So watch those where you escalate, because our tendency, if we're in a formal organization, is to escalate quickly, but that's not typically your best answer. Unapproved scope changes. That's a no-no in the traditional side for PMI. You don't give unapproved scope changes. Answering agile type questions. Agile questions are usually reward answers that emphasize collaboration, transparency, continuous feedback, empowered teams, and customer value. And so when you're looking at your 4 or 5 answers that they have there, and remember, you typically have two right answers for sure, and you're looking for the best of the two, not a right and compared to the wrong. And so when you look at that about customer value, empowerment, continuous feedback, you're looking at something that really typically is much more solid answer, because it includes these type of characteristics. Agile behaviors. Choose answers where the project manager facilitates team collaboration, encourages self-organization, removes impediments, that's going to be obstacles, promotes communication with the stakeholders. So when you look at something like this, you might think, well, why do we have a project manager and it's an agile project? Because you're going to have hybrid type questions. And so you will have a project manager in a lot of your agile or scrum questions that typically would not be there, but nevertheless, they're there in your test. Protect the Agile project manager role. So common correct answers in protecting the Agile project management role, which means it's a hybrid project, is removing impediments, facilitating the ceremonies, encouraging team ownership. Incorrect actions often include directly assigning work. So the project manager should not be making the decisions and assigning all the work, or enforcing rigid procedures. That's typically not going to happen on the Agile and Scrum side, even in a hybrid type setting, or overriding the team's decisions. These 3 incorrect actions typically I would stay away from for the test, because PMI really kind of has everything honed into a perfect setting. Next is protecting the product owner's role. Remember, the product owner is in charge of re-ranking the product backlog. So they're responsible for the product backlog, prioritization of features, maximizing the value. If a question involves changing priorities, the correct answer often includes collaborating with or consulting with the product owner. You're not making decisions without the product owner when you're talking about changing priorities, because the product owner is always going to be aligned with value and the customer. So you want to keep that in mind as you're thinking about the product owner. Protecting the sprint. When you talk about a sprint will begin at what might be 2 to 4 weeks typically on the test. And so what you're doing with this is the correct action pattern would be discuss with the product owner if something has gone wrong, add a request to the backlog, because remember, the product owner controls the backlog, consider the next sprint. And then wrong answers often include changing the sprint backlog immediately, interrupting the team during mid-sprints. Those are really no-nos on the test. You typically don't stop a sprint once it starts in for the purpose of this test. That sprint is going to run, and then you make your changes in the planning section before you start the next sprint. And then adapting to change, do not resist it. Remember, on the Agile side, you're supporting change. So correct answer patterns for Agile: reprioritizing the backlog, adjusting plans iteratively, incorporating feedback. Wrong answers on the Agile side would be rejecting change requests outright. Remember, you're doing Agile because you're trying to support change. And then locking the scope too early. Remember, you're only locking the scope at the beginning of the sprint. And so that means nothing changes once the sprint begins until that 4-week sprint is up or 3-week sprint is up, and then you deliver that to the demo, and then it goes through a retrospective, and then it's handed to the customer. And so that's what you're trying to support all the way through. Now, let me close out with this. Listen, we do virtual PMP boot camps, and I teach those every other month. So we'd love to be able to work with you and have you in some of our boot camps. You can send me an email, get on our website, you can register for the boot camp, or if you have questions about something, don't hesitate to send me an email or give me a call, okay? Have a great day. Wonderful. Hope you have a wonderful week. Bye now.